Hello, today we're going to talk about subscribing to events. So as a quick review, we've talked about publishing events before. So these are messages you send from the Argon to the cloud, so that whenever you want, almost like a serial monitor. They can be private, meaning they're in your account, or they can be public, meaning they are viewed by anybody in the world. Again, you shouldn't have any confidential data, passwords, APIs, your home location, things like that in a public event. And we've seen that you can access these in the app, in the console, or by subscribing, which is actually what we're going to talk about right now. Again, you can see all the events here on the console. We've kind of revisited this multiple times. Publishing is the similar syntax. Basically, you get to say particle.publish. You get to choose an event name. Now, this is going to be important for today. The event name can be any string that you want. And then you have the event value. This is typically some data that needs to come along with your process. And then you'll have public again, whether it's public or private, just your account. Remembering that we do have to have strings for both of these. And there is a limitation on how fast you want to send these, typically 1 per second. Okay, so now we get to complete the circle of subscribing to events that have been published. So what happens is there's the ability for the Argon to be notified whenever a particular event is published. We call this subscribing, and this is actually a concept that exists in microcontroller programming with the cloud, but also in mobile app development and pretty much any software development you might use. Some of you may be familiar with it from JavaScript, but the idea of subscribing to an event is very common, especially in mobile or web development. What happens is when the notification arrives, the Argon will call a particular function that's been set up ahead of time. We call this an event handler. It's not the name of a special function. It's like saying this is a variable. So an event handler is a particular kind of function that we're going to write. Whatever you want to have happen when the event comes in, that's what the function is going to do, the event handler does. For example, if you want to be updated what the weather is once an hour, you might have an event handler that gets notified from the cloud that here's the weather report, and then you might display it on your OLED or put it on the serial monitor or something. That's what the function would do. You have the ability to subscribe to public events or also private events that are just in your account. So I want to try to explain this idea of event programming in a couple different ways and see which one makes most sense to you. So in sort of a narrative form, you can say that the Argon says to the cloud, hey, there's this event I want to listen for. So I'd like to be notified when this event happens. At some point later in the future, could be minutes, hours, days, whatever, that event will happen. It'll get published to the cloud. So the Argon will then look and be notified by the cloud that this event just happened. And sometimes there'll be some data that gets passed along. In the weather report example, it might be the temperature for tomorrow. The Argon will then automatically execute the function that you set up ahead of time, the event handler. This is the part that confuses us a lot because the automatic part is really key. So you create the function and it gets called automatically. You don't actually call it. So if you look through your code, you will never see the function called in the loop or the setup or anywhere else. You simply define it and say, here's what's to happen when I'm notified, and then you're done. And then Argon will take care of it itself. And again, this is a really common concept in all kinds of programming. So some of you may have encountered it before, and some of you might encounter it in the future, this idea of event programming, because it's a pretty neat sort of way of designing software. So let's look at this in visual form, if that helps you a little bit more. Again, the Argon says to the cloud, I'd like to be notified when IoT is awesome event is published. By the way, when it's published, I'm going to use this function that I just created called event or awesome handler, and that's going to get called. Okay. Some time passes. Somewhere in the world, someone publishes an event to the cloud called IoT is awesome. Right? It could be your own device. It could be another device. It could be your friend's device. Doesn't matter. It gets published to the cloud. The cloud then says, oh, who's listening for this event? It could be millions of devices, but its job is to notify all of those devices. And so it does. It sends a notification to all the subscribers. The Argon then automatically calls the function that it agreed to call ahead of time, which is, in this case, awesome handler. And that's the process of subscribing to an event. So really, you're writing code that's going to be triggered most likely by something external to your device. So another example might be, let's say you have a refrigerator door connected to an Argon, and if the door is not closed for 3 minutes, it might send a message to the cloud and notify another device in a different room of the house to send a message to you or something. Right? You can imagine all kinds of scenarios. So the process in code is create the event handler and then subscribe. Now, the event handler is just a C++ function. It is a regular old function like any other function. It has special parameters, but basically it's a function. So, looking at the syntax again for publishing, because they're kind of related, we see that, again, there's an event name and an event value, and they both have to be strings. So, here's the syntax to create the event handler. Remember, the event handler is just a function in C++. So, it's always void. You give it a name. And the special thing is it takes two particular parameters. These are the only parameters this function can take. They're going to seem a little bit strange at first, but don't worry, we don't have to delve into them too much. The first parameter is a const char star, and the other parameter is a const char star. And so an example would be void temp event handler. We see that it's got this function, or this parameter event, and this parameter data. That's essentially how it might work. And then we talk about char star in just a moment. But you can see that they're kind of like strings. So we could print out a message that says, I just received the event, and then string event. So it's going to take this message, that's the event, print it out, and tell you what the value is. So it might be, for example, weather forecast is the event name, and the data might be cloudy, for example. That's an example of what this function could look like. So let's just talk a little bit about this. Again, event is the name. Data is the data, whatever that might be. Could be temperature, could be string, anything that's being sent from the subscription event. Okay, so const char star is a C++ C-style array. So if you're really curious, what that means is it is actually a character array. It's a pointer, which means it's pointing somewhere in memory. This is far more than I want us to know. All that I care about is I want you to treat it like a string. And kind of, you can know that it's sort of an array if you want, but we're going to treat it like a string, essentially. So what we're going to do is what you saw just a moment ago, is whenever those parameters come in, we're simply going to convert them to strings. And if you do that, you don't have to worry about the C++ parameters and pointers and C arrays, and don't worry about all that. So just consider that these const char stars are kind of like strings, which they are, and we're going to convert them, and then whatever you want to do with them after that, they're just a string. You could compare them to something, you could do uppercase, lowercase, whatever you wanted to do, you could do that. Just make sure you treat them like a string after that point. So the part of then subscribing to an event, we happen to do this in setup. And this is similar to publishing in that you say particle.subscribe, and then you give the event name. Right? So that's the string name for the event. Then you give the name of the function that you want to call. Now, what's important about this is, notice that there's no parentheses after this. So you're not calling the function, you're just giving the name of the function. So you put the function name, the event handler, without parentheses. My devices is the last parameter, it's the flag. This means private events, meaning I only want to be notified when my devices trigger these events. And public means, all devices means any device that publishes this event, I'd like to be notified.